He did not crawl out of that tunnel to save himself. By the time the white K9 emerged from the black mouth of the flood channel, the storm had already swallowed half the road, 3 power lines, and every sound except the hard, endless roar of water. Staff Sergeant Malcolm Hayes saw the dog before anyone else did. At first, it was only a pale shape moving against the current, low to the ground, almost colorless beneath the mud. Then lightning opened the sky over eastern North Carolina, and the animal came into view. A German shepherd, male, large, though exhaustion had pulled his body tight around his ribs. His white coat, normally bright as winter, was soaked gray with rainwater and tunnel grime. One front paw dragged slightly behind him. His ears were lowered, but his amber eyes remained fixed on the Marines gathered near the barricade. He carried something in his mouth. Malcolm stepped away from the rescue truck as cold rain struck the shoulders of his field jacket. Around him, Marines moved sandbags toward the washed-out shoulder of the road while emergency lights painted the water in silent flashes of red and blue. The tunnel had been declared unsafe 20 minutes earlier. It ran beneath an abandoned service road near Camp Lejeune, a concrete drainage passage nearly 6 feet high and more than half a mile long. During ordinary weather, it carried little more than runoff from the pine flats. Tonight, it had become a river beneath the earth. "Dog coming through," someone called. Malcolm raised one hand, and the men nearest the opening stopped. The German shepherd staggered onto the broken pavement. Water streamed from his chest and belly. Every breath seemed to take more strength than the last. Still, he would not release what he carried. It was a child's backpack, red once, though the fabric had darkened beneath mud and rain. One strap had torn loose. A small silver star hung from the zipper and tapped softly against the dog's teeth. The sound was nearly lost beneath the storm, but Malcolm heard it. A thin, metallic chime. Small, stubborn, alive. Navy Corpsman Elena Torres approached with a medical blanket folded beneath one arm. "Easy," she said, lowering herself a few feet away. The dog stopped. His legs shook. He looked at Elena, then past her, directly at Malcolm. Something in that stare held him still. It was not fear. It was not confusion. It felt closer to recognition, though Malcolm knew he had never seen this dog before. The shepherd took one more step, then another. His injured paw slipped on the wet pavement, and his body folded beneath him. He did not cry out. He simply landed on his chest and kept the backpack raised above the water running across the road. Malcolm moved before anyone could stop him. He crossed the distance, dropped to one knee, and slid an arm beneath the dog's shoulders. Up close, the animal smelled of wet fur, rust, and the cold mineral darkness of underground water. His heart beat fast against Malcolm's wrist. "I've got you," Malcolm said. The words came out lower than he intended. The shepherd did not relax. Instead, he turned his head and pressed the backpack against Malcolm's chest. Only then did his jaws open. The bag fell into Malcolm's hands with surprising weight. The dog's head sank onto the pavement. Elena wrapped the blanket around him and checked his breathing. "He's exhausted," she said. "Maybe hypothermic." But he made it. Malcolm barely heard her. Rain ran from the edge of his brow as he studied the backpack. A plastic name tag had been stitched beneath the front pocket. Mud covered most of the letters. He wiped it once with his thumb. The first name appeared slowly. Emma. He wiped again. The last name stopped the breath in his throat. Cole. For several seconds, the storm seemed to move farther away. Malcolm stared at those 4 letters while an old memory, one he had spent years learning not to touch, rose from somewhere deep and cold. A desert radio filled with static. A young Marine laughing beside a transport truck. A promise made beneath a foreign sky. Aaron Cole had been dead for 7 years. Yet his name was hanging from a child's backpack that had just been carried out of a flooded tunnel by a white K9 who looked at Malcolm as though the journey had ended exactly where it was supposed to. The dog stirred beneath the blanket. His amber eyes opened. He did not look at the medics. He did not look toward the warm truck or the dry shelter beyond it. He looked back at the tunnel. Then, with the last of his strength, he lifted one muddy paw and placed it against Malcolm's boot. Malcolm did not move his boot. The white shepherd's paw rested there as lightly as a question, trembling beneath the rain. Elena looked from the dog to Malcolm, then toward the tunnel where brown water continued to surge through the concrete mouth. "He wants you to understand something," she said. Malcolm lowered the backpack onto the hood of the rescue truck. The metal was cold beneath his hands. Around them, the storm worked at the world without mercy, shaking the pines and driving sheets of water across the abandoned service road. Lieutenant Daniel Mercer stood several yards away, speaking into a radio, his face tightened by the reports coming through. Another culvert had failed farther east. 2 families were missing near the county line. Every available team was already stretched thin. Malcolm knew all of that. Still, the name on the bag held him in place. Emma Cole. He pulled the zipper carefully. Water spilled from the front pocket and ran over his knuckles. Inside, he found a child's inhaler sealed in a plastic pouch, a red emergency whistle, and a folded photograph protected by a cloudy sandwich bag. The picture showed a woman standing beside 2 children on a sunlit porch. The older child, a girl with dark curls and a gap between her front teeth, held one hand on the shoulder of a white German shepherd. A younger boy stood close to her, smiling beneath a baseball cap that seemed too large for his head. Behind them hung a small American flag and a wooden sign painted with one word: home. Malcolm's chest tightened before he even turned the photograph over. On the back, written in blue ink, were the names Rachel, Emma, Noah, and Atlas. Below them was a date from 3 months earlier. Elena leaned closer. "Atlas," she said, glancing at the dog beneath the blanket. The shepherd's ears shifted at the sound, but his eyes remained on the tunnel. Malcolm searched the larger compartment. His fingers closed around a metal chain. He drew it out. Slowly, and a worn military identification tag dropped against the hood with a quiet click. The letters were scratched by time, but the name remained clear. Aaron Michael Cole. Malcolm stopped breathing for a moment. Rainwater gathered along the edge of the tag and fell in slow drops. He remembered Aaron as he had been at 29, quick to smile, always carrying peppermint gum, always writing letters home even when there was no mail truck for weeks. Aaron had believed promises were living things. He said they had to be fed by action or they would disappear. On their last deployment together, Aaron had pressed a spare tag into Malcolm's palm before a night patrol and told him that if anything ever happened, Rachel would need someone who understood silence. Malcolm had promised. Then grief, distance, and his own shame had turned that promise into 7 years of unopened letters and unanswered calls. "You know that name," Elena said softly. Malcolm closed his hand around the tag. "He served with me." His voice sounded far away. "He was my friend." Atlas lifted his head. The blanket slipped from one shoulder, revealing a faded leather collar beneath the wet fur. The dog gave a low breath, almost a whine, and pushed himself upright despite Elena's hand on his chest. "Easy, Atlas," she murmured. He ignored the warmth of the blanket. He ignored the open door of the rescue truck. Instead, he stepped toward the hood, touched his nose to Aaron's identification tag, then looked directly at Malcolm. The recognition was no longer something Malcolm could dismiss. The dog knew the scent of that metal. Perhaps he knew the man whose name was stamped into it. Colin. The second metallic sound came from somewhere beyond the first bend, faint enough that another gust of rain nearly erased it. Malcolm lifted his head and listened. Around him, the Marines became still. The generators hummed behind the rescue vehicles. Water rushed through the tunnel with the deep, unbroken voice of a river trapped beneath concrete. Then the sound came again. 3 strikes. A pause. 2 more. Atlas answered at once. His paw scraped the pavement 3 times, stopped, then moved twice. The white shepherd swayed when he finished, but his amber eyes remained clear. Elena steadied him beneath the chest. "That is not random," she said. Malcolm already knew. Years earlier, Aaron Cole had created the signal during a field exercise in California when dust had jammed their radios and visibility had dropped to less than 20 feet. 3 knocks meant a teammate had found something. 2 meant someone was waiting for a response. It was never written in a manual. It belonged only to the small circle of Marines who had trained together that summer. Malcolm had not heard it since Aaron died. Yet here it was, moving through a flooded tunnel in eastern North Carolina, as if 7 years had been only a long breath. Lieutenant Mercer turned toward the concrete entrance. "Could be debris striking a pipe." "Debris does not pause," Malcolm said. Mercer watched the black water for several seconds. He was not a cold man. Malcolm knew that. He was responsible for every Marine standing on that road, and responsibility had taught him to distrust hope when conditions were unstable. "We need confirmation," Mercer said. Elena reached for the identification tag on the hood, but Atlas moved before she touched it. He pressed his nose to the metal, inhaled once, then walked toward Malcolm. His steps were slow and uneven. He stopped at Malcolm's left side, exactly where a trained working dog would take position beside a handler. Malcolm felt the old memory before he understood it. Aaron had always walked on his right. His canine partner, during their months in the training program, had been taught to hold the left. Malcolm looked down at Atlas. "You were his," he whispered. The shepherd's ears lifted at the sound of Aaron's name. He touched Malcolm's closed hand, the one holding the tag, and released a low breath. Elena examined the faded collar more closely. Beneath the mud, barely visible in the leather, were stamped letters. She wiped them with the corner of the blanket. "United States Marine Corps Working Canine Program," she read. "The identification number is worn away." Atlas had not wandered into the storm by chance. He had been trained to carry, signal, return, and wait. More important, he had been taught not to abandon a task. Malcolm crouched beside him and opened the red backpack again. The inhaler was dry inside its sealed pouch. The whistle had a short cord tied around it. There was also a small notebook swollen with water. Most of the pages had blurred into blue clouds, but one page near the center remained partly readable. A child had drawn a white dog beneath a yellow sun. Beside him stood 4 figures holding hands. At the bottom, in careful block letters, were the words "Atlas always finds us." Malcolm ran one thumb along the edge of the page. "Emma wrote this." Elena nodded. "And she packed her medicine. That means she expected to leave home, or someone packed it for her." "The flood evacuation," Malcolm said. "They may have been driving when the road washed out." Mercer stepped closer to the tunnel map secured beneath clear plastic on the side of the command truck. The drainage passage crossed under the service road and connected to an older maintenance system built decades earlier. Most of the secondary chambers had been sealed, but one emergency access room remained approximately 800 feet from the entrance. If they reached that chamber, Mercer said, tracing the route with one finger, there could be an air pocket. "How long before it fills?" Malcolm asked. Mercer looked toward the engineer standing near the barricade. The man studied the water gauge and shook his head. "Maybe 40 minutes. Less if the western culvert fails." Atlas suddenly turned away from them. He faced the tunnel and raised his head. His nose moved against the wind coming from underground. Then he stepped forward. Elena caught the blanket as it slipped from his back. "He cannot go in again," she said. Atlas stopped at the edge of the current. His body trembled from cold and fatigue, but he did not retreat. Malcolm approached and placed a hand against the shepherd's wet neck. Beneath his fingers, he felt the dog's pulse and the quiet force of a decision already made. "You came out for help," Malcolm said. Atlas looked up at him. "Now show us where they are." The shepherd touched his nose to Aaron's identification tag one final time. Then from somewhere inside the tunnel, a red emergency whistle gave one weak, trembling note. The whistle faded almost as soon as it began, swallowed by the water and the storm above it. For one long second, no one spoke. Then Atlas stepped into the current. Malcolm tightened his hand around the dog's collar before the water could pull him forward. "Not yet," he said. Atlas looked back at him, breathing hard. His body was asking for rest. His eyes were not. Lieutenant Mercer turned toward the command truck. "Prepare a tether team," he ordered. The decision changed the air around them. Marines moved at once, lifting ropes, checking lights, securing harnesses. Elena wrapped Atlas in a thermal blanket again, but the dog kept his head pointed toward the tunnel. Malcolm stood beside him while rain ran down the back of his neck. He could feel Aaron's identification tag pressed into his palm, the edges cold and familiar. 7 years earlier, Malcolm had received another signal through noise and distance. He had hesitated then. Only a few seconds, perhaps, but grief had measured those seconds ever since. This time, he would not let fear disguise itself as caution. Mercer returned with a flashlight and a waterproof radio. "We verify from the entrance only," he said. "No one crosses the first bend until the engineer clears it." Malcolm nodded, though both men knew the tunnel might not wait for permission. They approached the opening together. The current struck the concrete walls and threw mist into their faces. 10 feet inside, daylight vanished. 20 feet inside, even the storm seemed far away. The world narrowed to the beam of Malcolm's flashlight, the scrape of boots against wet concrete, and Atlas's breathing beside him. The shepherd moved slowly, placing each paw with care. A safety line ran from Malcolm's harness back to the Marines outside. Mercer followed close behind. Elena remained at the entrance with medical gear ready, calling Atlas's name whenever his steps weakened. The tunnel smelled of iron, mud, and old standing water. Small branches and pieces of leaves turned in circles along the edges of the current. Somewhere above them, thunder rolled through the earth. Like distant machinery, they reached the first bend. A rusted maintenance pipe crossed the wall at shoulder height. Water dripped from a loose joint, tapping against the concrete in an uneven rhythm. Mercer lifted one hand. That could explain the sound. Malcolm listened. The pipe tapped twice, then once, then 4 times. Random. Hollow. Nothing like the signal they had heard. Atlas did not even look at it. He stood with his nose raised, testing the air moving through the darkness ahead. Then he took 3 steps toward the deeper passage and stopped. His ears lifted. Malcolm followed the direction of his gaze. At first, there was only water. Then something red appeared in the flashlight beam, caught against a metal grate 20 yards away. Mercer moved closer and pulled it free with a rescue pole. It was a child's knit cap, soaked through, with a small white snowflake stitched above the brim. Malcolm remembered the photograph. Emma had worn the same cap on the porch. They came this way, he said. Mercer looked toward the ceiling, where a thin crack ran across the concrete. Dust drifted from it each time thunder moved overhead. And we are done here, he said. The structure is shifting. The radio at his shoulder crackled. The engineer's voice came through in broken pieces, warning that the western culvert had begun to overflow. The water around Malcolm's boots rose another inch. Mercer gave the order to withdraw. Malcolm did not argue. He turned back toward the entrance. Atlas did not follow. The shepherd stood at the edge of the flashlight's reach, staring into the black passage beyond the bend. Atlas, Malcolm called. The dog remained still. Come. Atlas lowered his head and gave a soft whine. Then he walked to the wall, placed one paw against the concrete, and looked back at Malcolm. 3 scratches. A pause. 2 scratches. Mercer exhaled sharply. We heard it. We have evidence. That does not make the tunnel safe. Malcolm approached Atlas and rested one hand against his wet shoulder. He is not telling us what we already know. Atlas scratched again. 3. Pause. 2. Then he pressed his ear to the wall. Malcolm did the same. The concrete was cold. Against his cheek. At first, he heard only the heavy movement of water. Then, beneath it, came a sound so small it could have been imagined. A child coughing. Once. Then again. Malcolm closed his eyes. Someone is behind this wall. Mercer listened beside him. His expression changed. The wall was not solid. A narrow seam ran from floor to ceiling, half hidden beneath grime. An old service door had been sealed beneath layers of paint and mineral stain. Atlas pawed at the lower edge, where water slipped through a gap no wider than a finger. Mercer raised the radio. Command, we have possible survivors beyond a sealed maintenance access approximately 100 feet inside. Request immediate structural assessment and cutting equipment. Static answered first. Then the engineer's voice returned, tense and clear. Negative entry. The center chamber is under pressure. If that door opens, the water may shift through the entire passage. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. From the other side came the whistle again, weaker now, followed by a small voice that barely carried through the concrete. Atlas. The shepherd pressed his whole body against the door. Malcolm felt something inside him settle, not disappear, but become simple. He keyed the radio. There are children behind this wall. Mercer looked at him, then at the crack above them, then at the rising water around their boots. Outside, another warning sounded from the road. The tunnel had been declared dead, but behind the sealed door, someone had just called the dog by name. Mercer held Malcolm's gaze for one silent beat, then made the choice. We do this clean, he said. No forcing the door until we understand the pressure. Malcolm nodded. The water had climbed above their ankles now, cold enough to numb through their boots. Atlas remained pressed against the sealed access, his ears forward, listening for the child beyond it. Malcolm lowered himself beside the shepherd and placed his mouth near the narrow gap at the bottom of the door. Emma, he called. My name is Staff Sergeant Malcolm Hayes. I am with the Marines. Can you hear me? For several seconds, only water answered. Then a small voice came through, thin and shaking. Yes. Malcolm closed his eyes once. Are you hurt? No. My brother cannot breathe right. The words were followed by a faint cough somewhere farther inside. Malcolm looked toward Mercer. Both men understood at once. The inhaler was outside on the rescue truck, nearly 100 feet away, beyond a tunnel that was filling faster by the minute. Is your mother with you? Malcolm asked. She is here. She is awake, but she is very tired. How much water is in the room? There was a pause. Up to my knees. It keeps coming. Mercer raised the radio and requested the inhaler, a waterproof pouch, and a narrow delivery line. Static snapped through the speaker. Outside, Marines moved at once. Malcolm could hear their boots splashing toward the entrance. Atlas shifted beside him and scratched once at the lower edge of the door. The gap was too small for a hand, but perhaps not for something tied to a cord. Mercer studied the frame with his flashlight. Layers of rust and mineral buildup had sealed most of the access, yet the bottom right corner had lifted slightly away from the floor. There may be enough room to pass the medicine, he said. Not enough to open this safely. Malcolm spoke through the gap again. Emma, Atlas is here with us. The change on the other side was immediate. Atlas. Her voice cracked with relief. The white shepherd gave one soft bark. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Emma began to cry, quietly at first, then covered the sound as if she was trying to be brave for someone younger. He found you, she whispered. I told Mom he would. Malcolm rested a hand on Atlas's neck. The dog's coat was cold beneath his palm, but his heartbeat was steady now. Purpose had given him something exhaustion could not take. Emma, listen carefully, Malcolm said. We have Noah's medicine. We are going to send it under the door. You need to stay close and watch for it. Okay. The pouch arrived from the entrance clipped to a thin nylon line. Elena's voice came through the radio, calm and clear as she explained that the inhaler was sealed inside. Malcolm secured the pouch, flattened it with both hands, and pushed it toward the gap. It stopped halfway. The swollen edge of the door caught the plastic. Mercer tried from another angle. Again, it would not pass. Water pressed harder against their legs. Somewhere deep in the tunnel, concrete gave a low groan. Dust fell from the ceiling in a pale curtain. We have to withdraw, the engineer warned over the radio. Pressure is building behind the center chamber. Malcolm looked at Atlas. The shepherd was watching the pouch. Then he lowered his nose to the floor and pushed it toward the gap. The plastic folded slightly beneath his muzzle. Malcolm understood. He removed the inhaler from the outer pouch, wrapped it in a smaller waterproof sleeve, and tied it to the end of the nylon line. This time, it was narrow enough. He slid it beneath the door until the cord went slack. Emma, can you see it? He called. No answer. Malcolm pushed another foot of line through. Still nothing. Then the cord jerked once. A child's voice came through the gap. I have it. Malcolm exhaled. Behind him, Mercer turned away for a moment, hiding the relief on his face. Elena guided Emma through the inhaler steps over the radio, while Malcolm repeated each instruction through the door. One breath. Wait. Another breath. The tunnel seemed to hold still with them. Then Noah coughed, inhaled, and began to breathe more evenly. The sound was fragile, but it was enough to change the weight of the darkness. He is better, Emma said. He says thank you. Malcolm placed his forehead briefly against the cold door. Tell him Atlas brought it. The shepherd's ears lifted at his name. Mercer examined the wall beside the frame and found an old maintenance plate hidden beneath grime. He scraped it clean with the edge of his flashlight. A faded diagram appeared, showing a secondary access corridor on the far side of the chamber. There is another way in, he said. About 200 yards east, through the overflow junction. Malcolm looked toward the black passage ahead. The junction lay deeper inside, beyond the first bend, and beneath the section the engineer feared most. Mercer keyed the radio. Command, we have confirmed 3 survivors. Prepare a 4-person entry team. We are moving to secondary access. Atlas stepped away from the sealed door and faced the darkness before anyone gave him an order. Malcolm picked up the red child's cap and tucked it inside his jacket. Then he tightened the safety line around his harness. You came this far, he said to Atlas. The shepherd looked back once, amber eyes bright beneath the tunnel lights, then moved into the black water as if he already knew the way. The overflow junction began where the tunnel narrowed, and the ceiling dropped low enough that Malcolm could touch it with one raised hand. Water pressed against his shins, then his knees, cold and heavy, carrying twigs, leaves, and small pieces of broken wood past his boots. Atlas moved ahead with careful steps, his white coat almost silver beneath the flashlight beams. Mercer followed close behind Malcolm, while two Marines, Corporal James Reed and Lance Corporal Owen Price, managed the safety line and portable light. Every few yards, the radio cracked with Elena's voice from the entrance, confirming that Emma and Noah were still responding from behind the sealed door. Rachel's voice remained faint. The tunnel curved east beneath the service road, exactly as the old maintenance diagram had shown. At the first split, Atlas stopped. One passage sloped downward toward a deeper channel. The other rose slightly and carried less water. Mercer aimed his light toward the higher path. That should be the overflow route. Atlas turned toward the lower passage. Malcolm watched him. Atlas. The shepherd did not move. His nose remained close to the surface, reading something beneath the smell of rust and floodwater. Mercer studied the diagram again. The lower route dead ends at a filtration chamber. Then why is he choosing it? Reed asked. No one answered. Atlas took 3 steps into the lower passage and looked back. Malcolm followed. Mercer hesitated only a moment before signaling the others forward. The ceiling lowered again. Their shoulders brushed damp concrete. Water reached Malcolm's thighs, and each step demanded effort. The sound of the storm disappeared completely. There was only breathing, splashing, and the faint metallic hum of the emergency. Lights strapped to their chests. Atlas moved slowly but without uncertainty. At the next junction, he turned left. Then right. Then left again. Malcolm began to wonder whether exhaustion had finally confused him. The dog had crossed this maze once already in darkness and moving water. Perhaps scent had shifted. Perhaps the current had erased whatever trail he had followed. Mercer's voice was quiet behind him. We may be losing time. Malcolm knew he was right. The secondary access corridor should have been farther east, not below them. He looked at Atlas, who had stopped before a corroded steel grate. Beyond it lay a square chamber filled with darkness. Price helped lift the grate from its track. Atlas slipped through first. Malcolm followed and raised his flashlight. The room was empty. No Rachel. No Emma. No Noah. Only concrete walls, a rusted ladder, and water swirling around an old floor drain. A child's blanket floated near the far corner. It was pale blue, decorated with small yellow stars. Atlas waded toward it and lowered his nose. Malcolm felt the hope inside him turn thin. Mercer entered the chamber and surveyed the walls. This is the filtration room. The access diagram is wrong, or we took the wrong branch. We followed him, Reed said. The words were not accusing, but they landed heavily. Malcolm reached for the blanket. It was cold and soaked, one corner dark with mud. He recognized it from the photograph in the backpack, folded across the porch swing behind Emma and Noah. They had been here, but they were not here now. They moved, Malcolm said. Mercer checked his watch. Or the water carried this from another chamber. The radio hissed. Elena's voice came through, broken by interference. Malcolm, Emma says the water is near her waist now. Noah is breathing, but Rachel is getting weaker. Malcolm closed his eyes for half a second. Understood. Mercer stepped closer. We returned to the main route. Now. Malcolm nodded. He had trusted Atlas because of Aaron, because of the signal, because guilt had made every choice feel like a second chance. Maybe that had been a mistake. Atlas stood beside the blanket, staring at the floor. Come, Malcolm, said. The shepherd did not respond. Atlas, come. The dog pawed the blanket once. Malcolm reached down to pull it free. Atlas caught the edge gently between his teeth and dragged it aside. Beneath it, hidden by mud, was a narrow metal vent cover. Someone had scratched marks into the grime around it. 3 lines. A pause. 2 lines. Malcolm knelt and wiped the surface clean. Beside the marks, written in white chalk with the uneven hand of a child, were 5 words. Atlas went to find help. No one spoke. The chamber suddenly felt smaller, closer, alive with the proof they had nearly walked past. Malcolm pressed his ear against the vent. Air moved through it, carrying the faint scent of damp fabric and something sweet, like children's shampoo. Then he heard Emma's voice, distant but clear enough. Mom, he came back. Atlas gave one low sound in his throat and touched his nose to the vent. Mercer crouched beside Malcolm and aimed his flashlight along the wall. The vent duct angled upward behind the concrete, toward a passage not shown on the old diagram. "There is another corridor above us," he said. Price found the rusted ladder fixed to the wall. It led to a maintenance hatch 12 feet overhead. Malcolm looked up. The hatch was closed, but water dripped steadily from its edges. Atlas had not led them the wrong way. He had led them to the only path the flood had not erased. Malcolm stood and secured his flashlight. "We climb." Mercer tested the first rung. It held. Above them, something shifted behind the hatch, followed by a child's weak cough. Atlas placed both front paws against the ladder and looked up into the darkness. Mercer climbed first, testing each rung before trusting his weight to it. The old ladder complained softly beneath him, metal groaning against bolts buried in the concrete. Malcolm followed with the safety line clipped to his harness, while Reed and Price held position below. Atlas remained at the base, his front paws braced against the lowest rung, eyes fixed upward. 12 feet above the chamber floor, Mercer reached the maintenance hatch and pressed one shoulder against it. The steel panel did not move. Water leaked through the seam in. Thin, steady threads, striking his sleeves and running down his arms. "It is swollen in the frame," he said. Malcolm climbed beside him as far as the narrow ladder allowed. Together they pushed. Nothing. From beyond the hatch came a small voice. "Atlas." "Emma," Malcolm called, keeping his tone calm. "We are directly below you. Move away from the hatch. Mom cannot stand. Can you help Noah move back?" A pause followed, then a quiet yes. Malcolm waited until he heard shuffling above. Mercer placed a short pry tool beneath one corner of the panel. The metal shifted less than an inch, releasing a breath of cold air that smelled of wet concrete, old dust, and the faint sweetness Malcolm had noticed near the vent. "Again," Mercer said. They pressed together. The hatch lifted another inch, then settled back. The structure around them gave a low vibration. Water trembled in the chamber below. Price looked toward the tunnel entrance behind them. "The current is changing." Elena's voice broke through the radio. "The western culvert is failing. You may have less than 15 minutes before the lower passage becomes impassable." Mercer looked at Malcolm. No explanation was necessary. Even if they opened the hatch, carrying 3 people back through the same route might take too long. Malcolm keyed the radio. "Find another exit from the upper corridor. Send us every map the county has." "Working on it," Elena answered. Above them, Noah coughed. The sound was softer than before, but too close to silence. Malcolm set one boot higher on the ladder and pressed both hands beneath the hatch. "Emma, we are opening it now." Atlas barked once from below. The sound moved through the chamber and into the space above, and a child began to cry with relief. Malcolm pushed. Mercer pulled with the pry tool. The hatch rose suddenly, spilling several gallons of water over their shoulders. Cold struck Malcolm's face and chest. He held his grip. Mercer forced the panel sideways until it lodged against the wall. A narrow opening appeared, barely wide enough for one person. Malcolm climbed through first. The upper corridor was smaller than he expected, perhaps 4 feet high, forcing him onto his hands and knees. Emergency markings, faded nearly white, ran along one wall. Water covered the floor to a depth of several inches and flowed toward the open hatch. His flashlight found Emma 10 feet away. She was 9 years old, just as the photograph had shown, though her dark curls were soaked against her cheeks. One arm was wrapped around Noah, who sat beneath a silver emergency blanket. Beside them, Rachel Cole leaned against the wall, pale with exhaustion but awake. Emma stared at Malcolm's uniform. "You are really a Marine." "Yes," he said, and Atlas kept his promise. Her face changed at the dog's name. She looked toward the hatch. "Can he come up?" Malcolm glanced back. The opening was narrow, and the ladder would be difficult for an exhausted dog. Atlas had already placed one paw on the first rung. Reed supported him from beneath while Mercer reached down. Step by step, Atlas climbed, his injured front leg trembling each time it took weight. At the top, Malcolm slid both arms beneath his chest and lifted him through. The moment his paws touched the upper corridor, Atlas moved past everyone. He crawled to Emma, pressed his head beneath her chin, then turned to Noah and touched his nose gently to the boy's hand. Noah managed a small smile. Rachel reached for the shepherd's wet coat. "You found them," she whispered. Atlas leaned against her, but his eyes returned to Malcolm. There was no celebration in them. The task was not finished. Mercer examined the corridor markings. There should be an emergency shaft east of here. Rachel shook her head. We tried it. The outer grate would not open. How far? Malcolm asked. Maybe 150 feet. Another vibration passed through the concrete. The water at their knees began moving faster toward the hatch. Elena's voice returned over the radio. I found the original drainage plans. The upper shaft leads to a service yard on the east side, but the release wheel is inside the corridor. It may be hidden behind a maintenance panel. Emma pointed deeper into the darkness. Atlas kept going over there before he left us. Malcolm aimed his light in that direction. On the wall, almost invisible beneath, peeling paint, were 3 muddy paw marks. They ended beside a square metal panel. Mercer opened it and found a red wheel locked beneath years of rust. He gripped it with both hands. It did not turn. Malcolm joined him. Together they pulled until the wheel shifted with a sharp metallic cry. Somewhere ahead, heavy machinery moved for the first time in decades. A current of fresh air entered the corridor. Then the radio went silent. The lights flickered. Behind them, water poured through the open hatch faster than before. Atlas rose, placed himself between the children and the advancing water, and faced the newly opened darkness. Fresh air moved through the upper corridor in one cold breath, carrying the smell of wet grass and pine from somewhere beyond the concrete. Malcolm felt it against his face and knew the service yard was open, but not yet close. The darkness ahead remained narrow and low, forcing every adult to crouch while the children could move only slightly faster. Behind them, water poured through the maintenance hatch and spread across the floor in a widening sheet. Mercer took Rachel's arm and helped her stand. Reed lifted Noah carefully against his chest, keeping the boy's blanket wrapped around him. Emma stayed beside Atlas, one hand buried in the wet fur at his neck. The shepherd did not pull away. He placed himself between her and the rising water, then looked to Malcolm for direction. We move east, Malcolm said. Stay together. Nobody gets separated. His voice was calm, but the corridor was changing with every second. The water that had reached only their ankles now pushed at mid-calf. Emergency lights flickered against the walls, turning every shadow into something that seemed to move. Price took the rear position and guided the safety line through the open hatch, while Mercer led with the map fixed in his memory. Malcolm walked beside Emma and Atlas. The girl's breathing was fast but controlled. Is my mother going to be all right? She asked. She is with us, Malcolm said. That is what matters right now. Emma looked back at Rachel, who gave her a tired smile. Atlas touched his nose to Emma's hand, and she tightened her grip on his collar. The corridor bent sharply to the right. Ahead, the concrete floor disappeared beneath a deeper section of water. Mercer stopped and tested it with a rescue pole. Almost 3 feet, he said. Maybe deeper in the center. Rachel could not cross without help, and Emma was barely tall enough to keep her head clear if the water rose again. Malcolm studied the walls. A rusted utility rail ran along one side, bolted at shoulder height. Clip the line to the rail, he said. We move one at a time. Reed crossed first with Noah. The water climbed to his waist, but the rail held. Mercer followed, then reached back for Rachel. She took 2 steps and faltered. Malcolm caught her under one arm before the current could turn her. I am sorry, she whispered. You do not owe anyone an apology, he said. Just keep moving. Atlas entered next with Emma. The water reached the dog's chest. His injured leg slipped once, but he corrected himself and pressed close to the girl's side. Emma held the line with one hand and Atlas with the other. Halfway across, a surge of water rushed through the corridor. The safety rope snapped tight. Emma gasped. Atlas moved without hesitation, bracing his body against her legs until the current passed. Malcolm crossed behind them, one hand on the rail and the other ready beneath Emma's arm. When they reached the far side, the girl knelt and wrapped both arms around Atlas's neck. You came back, she whispered. The shepherd closed his eyes for one brief second, then lifted his head again. He was still working. The corridor rose gradually after the flooded section. Fresh air strengthened, and the sound of rain became clearer through the walls. Then they reached the emergency shaft. A metal staircase climbed nearly 20 feet to a grated opening above. Pale daylight showed through the bars, but the grate remained only partly raised. A fallen branch had wedged across it from outside. Mercer climbed and pushed. The grate moved less than 6 inches. Not enough, he said. Malcolm looked back. Water rounded the last bend and began advancing toward them. There was no time to return. Price and Reed joined Mercer on the stairs, pressing their shoulders beneath the steel. The grate lifted another inch, then stopped. Malcolm searched the shaft walls and found an old counterweight chain coated in rust. He pulled once. Nothing. Atlas watched him, then moved toward a narrow drainage slot at the base of the wall. The shepherd lowered his nose and pawed beside it. Malcolm crouched. Behind the slot, hidden by mud, was a small release lever connected to the counterweight. He cleared it with his fingers and pulled. The chain jumped. Above them, the grate rose suddenly, throwing rain and gray morning light into the shaft. Cold air rushed down like a blessing. Mercer climbed through first and dragged the fallen branch aside. Reed passed Noah up to him. Emma followed, then Rachel. Malcolm lifted Atlas toward the stairs, but the shepherd resisted and looked behind them. Price was still securing the safety line as water reached the bottom step. Go, Malcolm ordered. Price climbed. Atlas waited until every person had left the shaft. Only then did he place his paws on the first stair. Malcolm stayed beneath him, supporting his weakened leg as they climbed together. At the top, Marines pulled them into the service yard beneath the rain. Elena ran toward the family with medical blankets and an oxygen kit. Noah was breathing. Rachel was conscious. Emma was safe. Atlas stepped onto the grass, took 2 unsteady paces, then turned back toward the open shaft, as if counting every soul who had come out. Malcolm knelt beside him. All accounted for, he said. Atlas looked at Emma. She nodded through her tears. Only then did the white shepherd let his body rest against Malcolm's chest.